What is up, everybody? Welcome to Comic Book Club. I'm Alex.
I'm Justin.
I'm Pete.
And we are bringing you a special bonus episode of the podcast with one of our favorite writers of all time, talking about one of our favorite current books. Ladies and gentlemen, Kieron Gillen.
Yeah.
Oh, I almost saluted, and of course, a salute is no use in a podcast. So
You just hear the respect of the finger to forehead.
We appreciate the gesture.
Yeah.
We Foley in some stuff afterwards, so we would have added like a whoosh or something.
Whip crack.
Yes. So very excited to chat about Once and Future. We have talked about every issue of the book. I know Pete is going to have a million questions about one character in particular, but before we get to it, just hold it in for a second, Pete. The big thing that we've discussed about it, and we're fans of all your work, this feels very different in a good way. It feels almost like the big budget, Hollywood, over-the-top action, still working in those story elements and those mythic elements that you like to hit. But I'm curious to hear from you. What was the initial germ? What was the genesis? What were you trying to do differently as a writer with this book?
it's always interesting because, like most things, I can sort of see the multiple origins of it. I guess it's like, and I've said this before in interviews, but like the core idea I've had for must be at least the mid-noughties, because I just had the idea of how could you do a sort of Indiana Jonesy, mummy-esque story and sort of bleed the colonialism from it. And the idea is, you just do it because immediately it was it's a bit weird just going back and shooting the founding people the founding rulers of another people. It's just something increasingly odd about that. And I thought, I know what you do it. You do it in the UK. You do it with King Arthur, and you have everything I love about that genre, but you can have it in a different sort of conversation. And of course, as soon as I have that idea, it becomes, this is about the matter of Britain. This is about what on earth is this stupid country of mine? So all that was sort of sitting there, and the idea came up because Boom just, to be honest, mailed me and said, Dan would be interested in working with you. Have you got any interest to do a book with him? And it's just involved me. Okay, what am I interested in doing? And I saw, most people have got a load of stuff in the files. And I hit this, actually, this makes sense, because it's Dan interested in doing an action horror book. And because it's also the thing about comics is it's a little bit between having a leading actor or a little bit like a musician. And that kind of, or a singer is a better way of putting it. So, let's say I found myself having to work with a Bjork. If I'm going to work with Bjork, and I've been looking through my material to think, okay, what would work with Bjork? And the same with Dan. Dan is just he is one of the greatest action storytellers, and of course every issue is better and better as well. It's weird. Yeah. Everyone always says this, but in this case, it's with Dan, I just feel like I'm watching a talent who's always the astounding blossom with every single page. So it's okay. He's a completely full-on monstrous action storyteller. He does really charismatic characters. All my friends who fancy men, let's say all of them say that Dan does the best beefcake. So it's okay. I need attractive men. There's definitely that kind of. And then I was like, okay, yeah. What also Dan? Then of course I just asked him, Dan, what are you interested in doing you haven't done? And that of course was hot, and that was actually horror. So it's okay, great. So that's the tone of the book, sort of. Actually, I want Dan is a great full-on action storyteller. Let's do a full-on action storyteller book. And plus, the first arc, you can see me sort of step back from my vertigo-ness occasionally. You know what I mean? There's some storytelling choices which work fine because Dan can do anything. But I was aware that by leaning into his instincts and powers, you get better results than leaning against them. So that's the aesthetics of it, and the white. And I must admit, when the idea sort of came back in my files when I was looking at Dan, it was, this is the story that would have worked at any point in the last 1,500 years in Britain, because the nature of the question of the question of what is Britain anyway has always been there. But with the Brexitiness of it all, it becomes a little bit even more pointed. So does that answer the question? It might answer several questions.
I have a follow-up. When you're in a book like Die, say, it feels like it's about expanding the universe. Every issue, it's like, well, did you know about this place and all the aesthetics of that? But with Once and Future, it feels like it's getting sharper and more focused on. It's like moving in two different directions between those two books. Is that an intentional choice when you're putting them together?
There's only there's only a limited amount of work in the world you can do. There's also that aspect. So I remember I was doing I think 2 books I was doing at once. It's I could not have done 4 books like Phonogram a month. This is always the thing. even if I had the energy, it's like emotionally I haven't got it. So when I'm doing my books, I'm sort of trying to create like a stable of books in this kind of like, okay, this scratches this scratches that. And where Once the Future is different is the first time I can think of where I've tried to do what I tend to do in my work for hire books, but owning it. You know what I mean? And then, like, in some ways, Once the Future is closer to my Marvel work than it is to, say, Die. In that, yes, there's quite a lot of research into Once the Future, but it's not like as much as Die. Die's like at least 50. I've lost count the number of books I've read to write Die, and I'm not even including RPG source books in there. Once the Future is a much smaller body. I mean, I said it's still significant, but it's not the level of, okay, this panel is referencing this one thing. You know what I mean? So like I'm scratching that. So yeah, it was definitely that in that period I wasn't doing any work for hire, like for Marvel or anyone else. So the idea of, okay, let's do something that's actually fun. And that's the thing I kind of guilty. It wasn't like, especially when it won when it got the Eisner nomination. It's like being nominated for an Eisner for something fun. That's not fair. I should be.
Speaking of fun, my favorite character is the grandma. You have helped create one of the top grandmas of all time. Like, for me as a little kid, this is kind of how I saw my grandma. Like, she was this magical woman who could do anything, and it was like just like another day to her. Can you talk a little bit about this character?
It's like, this is actually the flip, because obviously I mentioned earlier the core idea was, okay, Arthur as mummy villain. And the one thing that idea doesn't include is who is the adventuress. And I didn't just want to make throw in a standard adventurer. That doesn't necessarily interest me. So it's, okay, what emotional relationships do I not see in that kind of fiction very much? And also what emotional relationships from my own life have I not written? So and I immediately went to my gran. In that, as you said, it's like, my gran lived around the corner from me. Was the gran I saw most of. And she was, and I found that dynamic between Duncan and Bridget is a little bit like me, and trust, I'm not as goofy as Duncan, and she's not as hard ass as Bridget. But she came over from Ireland when she was 14. She was like, she was arrested as a suspected terrorist and all that kind of stuff. And I'm I think the first kid in my extended Irish Catholic family to go to university, so that kind of class, despite both being working class, that kind of where we came from in different parts of our lives. I thought, okay, that's interesting. I have not put that in a character yet. And especially because, the stuff families don't talk about is also interesting. So the second I had that, okay, grandmother, grandson, you don't see enough of that. You don't see enough about grandparent, grandchild. In fact, you more like to see grandmother, granddaughter. But that kind of cross-generational, but also cross-gender. Yeah, that seemed like, okay, there's something there. Especially because Duncan is in many ways a damsel, at least for a lot of it.
Sure. And so that makes me ask: is there like a second cousin, great uncle story you're working on? Are you thinking up the dynamics?
It's like, honestly, it's a bit like you just think about what haven't you seen, and there's a bit like, for me, it's always like, what's interesting, especially because I'm somebody who always tries to ground relationships, at least distantly, and stuff from my own life. That kind of this reminds me of this, but then you twist it. I always remember when I was learning to write comics, it's like Mark Waid talking about obviously I've never fought Dr. Doom, but I know what it's like to stand up to a bully in a playground, and that was a line that always sort of stuck with me, because it's that kind of stuff is the way you translate stuff, because it's never one for one, but you can find a tiny core of that emotion and bring it to the work, and that's kind of the extended. The Duncan. I mean, my mum. Actually, spoilers for Once in the Future. But my family is not like that family, and I am not being trained as a monster hunter.
We'll see.
Well, it's interesting to hear you talk about Duncan as a damsel, because you do have that first arc, which, like you were touching on, is very much the training arc, where he's learning with his grandmother. We're setting up the world, like Justin was talking about, with King Arthur and Camelot and other members of the court. Is the second arc, for those who haven't read it, but it's starting to get into Beowulf and Grendel and other aspects of British myths, I guess you could put it that way. Is it more difficult when you have the character has already technically been trained and you're heading into that second arc, or does that free you up in a certain way?
Well, I think Once in Future, I'm very fond of the first arc, but in terms of it's a little bit tightly compressed for me. As in, in some ways, I've become Once the Future's become more fluid to write after we've done the setup, because it's like I must say I've got Once the Future sort of plans for like issue 30, and then I've got a few ideas where it could go from there. But at the same time, it's not like Die or Wigdiv in that both of those stories always had an end, or Uber. In fact, most of my work has the hard ending.
Right.
And that's when those characters are done. We do not write them anymore. I mean, Die's a little bit different because I've got ideas for sequels to Die, but at the same time, that story is a closed block. Once the Future is like what the game designer and writer Robin D. Laws describes as iconic characters. He's got the idea then the dramatic characters, and dramatic characters are about like Hamlet or Macbeth. They are characters who tell a story, have an arc, and end. Mm-hmm. And I've tended to write dramatic characters even when I'm writing the other side, which are iconic characters. Iconic characters like Sherlock Holmes or Batman. As in, we don't come in to really see them change. We come to see them do their thing.
Yeah.
As a Batman adventure is a chance for Batman to express the core Batmanness.
Yeah.
And in cases like Bridget and Duncan, I think they are closer to iconic characters than dramatic characters. Like I've got a really, the dramatic arc is something I really like. But like abstractly, you can plug those characters into adventures indefinitely. In like, the Hellboy. There's a lot of Hellboy DNA in Once in the Future.
It feels very much that thing of characters being like, oh, here we go again. And there's just another thing to reload the mechanism with these guys. I mean,
exactly. I mean, like it's very out of fashion at the moment, but you could do absolutely Once in the Future as a Monster of the Week TV show, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And of course, that's not how I write it. And immediately you've got this, just like, it's not as big as Die, which is perpetually getting bigger, but like, it's a significant universe. And like, we've sort of, there's a wonderful bit that Dan does in, issue 13 where we basically do 3 panels and each one is an adventure you haven't seen. So like, you get that kind of like, okay, here's the bit they did this. You're not going to see it except for this panel, which I love. You know what I mean? Like, I love doing that to make the universe bigger, but only in that way that making the shadows more interesting. Like, there's always more stuff going on, but we're focusing on this bit.
Well, I'm glad you worded it that way, because I was worried you're going to be like, I like messing with you, the reader, being like, haha, you don't know about this.
Well, there's a lot of big. I mean, like, what's the future? Like the fact we did the big twists in. There's a variety of twists in the first arc. There's certainly stuff which you don't know. Mm-hmm. Like it's the kind of like. And like I was saying this online recently. I was discussing one of the problems of mysteries in comics is, in fact, mysteries full stop in all media is you have to remind the reader that you not knowing something isn't a plot hole, but it's as in it's like deliberately the fact that, for example, we haven't said there's Galahad. Galahad that implies there's a Lancelot because now Nimue, then Elaine would have had to have sex with a Lancelot to begat a Galahad. So who's the Lancelot? And we haven't mentioned that for like a long time. But like I've got to remind people that exists to make sure they remember that's still a mystery. You know what I mean? So there's definitely stuff to reveal, and there's some really fun, hopefully satisfying bits. Because I said, the structure going towards issue 30, but it is less the crazy guy with a load of lines on the wall as well.
Well, there's. I think you touched on this a little bit already, but there's something very different about the mythology of Camelot versus Beowulf and Grendel, just because Beowulf and Grendel is so much more compact. Again, was that sort of freeing in the second arc to be like, great, I just need to write these 2 monstrous characters, have these big action sequences, and then I could get back to that more complex Camelot mythology?
Yeah. I think it's interesting. Like what I think the Beowulf, despite being really compressed, like you say, Beowulf is a text. It's a book, as opposed to Arthur, which is a sprawling mythos. And of course, what throwing Beowulf is, it both widens the story in terms of like, okay, we mentioned vampires in the first issue. We've mentioned a couple of other things, but here's something a bit more significant. And what does that imply? As in, who else could they be fighting? As in, if Beowulf's out there, who else is out there? But also the idea of like, how do Arthur and Beowulf differ? And of course, as you've said, I've just said as well, there's only one Beowulf story that we, and of course in our universe, okay, what does that mean? Where does that go? So as well as being able to throw, Grendel and Beowulf at them, we also get the kind of, okay, so why is there only one Beowulf story? And that's like, obviously only issue 10's come out, and that's sort of inching closer to explanation. But like just by reducing it, it also expands it at the same time in a way that I hope people find compelling, because it's I'm aware I have a tendency of a writer for things to explode indefinitely, because I quite like, making stuff up is fun. And it always has a structure, but the structure can occasionally become overwhelming. And like, Once and Future just feel more like the pop song. I mean, I sort of said this when I was doing Once and Future, like, actually the first question, one of the ideas was, okay, let's assume that I've already made the argument that Wick said. As a Wick and Divine basically said something about stories and the nature of stories and how they deceive us. Let's assume that from the first issue that everyone knows this. And so Once and Future is a universe where stories are just bad. As in stories are 100% parasites who want to kill us. Oh, wow. And that's like, and that, having that up front allows me to be a bit more clearer about it. Like, all stories are bad. Every single one you meet is going to try to kill you in this universe. And it's quite compelling because it means that. Because I see you often say fans saying, "Does this mean that like Morgana is going to be good?" It's like, no, she's also bad. She's a story. They're all bad.
It's interesting to hear you say that, and I'm definitely on your side here. But we've had this argument on almost every issue. And Pete, I'm gonna throw you under the bus here, but I feel like you're the one that's argued like, well, maybe King Arthur isn't that bad. Is there any point, Kieron, that you're like, I kind of agree with his argument, whatever that is?
I think, like, especially now we've got Merlin in, the implicit tragedy of almost any panel when Merlin and Arthur are in. Like, Merlin's clearly knows more than Arthur does, and Merlin's heartbroken over it, despite the fact they're clearly villains. That's like, talking about mysteries. It's like, okay, something's going on there, and clearly I'm going to tell you about it eventually. So, like, there's something. Just because I think stories want to kill you, I don't think individual stories are bad. It's worth stressing. This is just Once and Future. As it is very clearly. That's the game. My wife in the last couple of years, my wife going to improv, and of course, improv people talk about the concept of game. The idea that the game.
Here we go. This is our language. This is our lane right here.
And of course, in the case of like Once and Future, the game is stories are evil, and we're going to play with that game. And of course, like, I don't believe in stories that die. I don't believe stories are evil, so my story isn't going to say that eventually, completely. But the push and pull between it is where it's interesting. Sorry to interrupt. I think that's so interesting because it's like stories are evil, but you can't kill them. They have to play out, or they have to finish, and you have to find a way to complete it where it doesn't kill you. And in this case, stories make you powerful. There's a bit in issue 13. This is very minor spoilers, but it's like Duncan gets beaten up by people who aren't, and it's like, yeah, he's good at fighting stories. That's what the story lets you do.
So at this point, this is open-ended, is what you're saying. You don't have a plan for like 30 issues, 50 issues. Potentially, it could go on forever.
Yeah. I mean,
it's very exciting.
When I said the iconic characters, these are pretty much the first characters I've invented, which I, own. I can imagine if someone else writing. It's like, in the same way, like, someone else wrote, I could imagine passing on the book to somebody else to write, because, as I said, they're robust enough characters you can plug into mysteries and have fun with. I could imagine that happening. Not that I have any plans for that, but, it is something that I could see happen. I say that, it's like, I would love to just, like, do a mini of, like, people doing one-off Bridget and Duncan stories and, get Becky Cloonan to do an issue and just, tear it up.
Well, there's a certain sense of when you do something like that, it actually does extend the life of the book, the franchise, versus certainly it's preferable to have one or two voices, including Dan Mora, in that to focus it. But when you do something like that, it starts to, in the reader's mind, I think, feel a little bigger and take on a life of its own.
Something I say about my Marvel, when I do work for hire for like Marvel or whoever, the characters I've introduced to a world do not feel real in the Marvel Universe way until someone else has written them. You know what I mean? Until then, it feels like I'm cheating. Almost all my characters, when they like Aphra or even like really very small, like very minor characters, the second they've been written by someone else, they feel part of the Marvel firmament. So I completely get that. I mean, I say this, I have no plans to pass it on. I'm just very aware that it could happen in an abstract sense.
Yeah.
And it's funny, it's like I said, I've got strong plans up to 30. And then it's like I've got other big, bad sort of areas I would like to touch in mythology. And that's the question, how long does that go for if I wanted to? Or like, do you stop and then come back? And, I mean, it's unusual for me because all my stuff is like I came to comics because I like stuff with set endings. Like the stuff I got into comics through is the stuff that ends. And in some ways, even like as a business thing, comics, the idea that comics have to be unending is not something I necessarily like. I think comics would probably be healthier if we turned over the franchises involved in it more often. But at the same time, I can't deny there's something really fun about them as well.
Yeah. I mean, on that note, before we let you go, and we'll come back to What's in Future for a second, I'd be remiss not to ask about Eternals. You are going back to Marvel. You are doing that. That's the opposite of a finite story right there in the title. What drew you to that? What is your take on Eternals?
It's one of those things like I've had a few years off working for. I mean, literally, it's going to be 5 years, almost the month since I stopped working for the Marvel Universe. When I come back, like obviously I did a load of Star Wars work, but I had exhausted my thought processes, I think, and like I was burnt out, and I wanted a gap. And I did a mini last year with Casper Wingard, the Peter Cannon mini, which was me sort of dabbling about whether I've got anything else to say about superheroes. So they approached me and said, "Are you interested in Eternals?" And immediately was sort of sitting back and thinking about that in terms of like, actually, this is one of the things which, like, especially talking to like when anyone's listening who's like a hardcore superhero fan, they're quite surprised by people thinking like this. But I explicitly do not think about a character until I'm asked to have you any ideas to them, because me thinking about something I cannot write is like it's almost like it's just a waste of my energies in terms of like my thought patterns, and you can't help it. Obviously, I do it all the time, but at the same time, I don't. So immediately, sit back and it was like, okay, have I any ideas about Eternals? And like, especially to think about like what I want to do. I mean, like as a concept, and of course, this normally involves I go back and read a bunch. So, like, you know, I go back and read the original Kirby Eternals. I read, I sort of trace through the path of them through the Marvel Universe. Specifically, you look at the more recent stuff like John Romita and Gaiman's arc, and just think about what is interesting about Eternals, and also what are the problems of Eternals, as in why, you know, how can they have a home? Because this is one of the things me and Jamie talk about when we talk about our own books. We talk about this quite regularly. Is the like, you can't introduce a character into the DC universe who is the paragon of all that's good and everybody loves them and the most powerful person, because that job is taken. And we joke, it's like we use the baby boomer metaphor. Like, most jobs are taken and they're never going to retire. So like, if you're just in DC, you're looking for like ecosystems and places where a new character can live, and they do a task that no one else is presently doing. And in the question of Eternals, it's like, okay, let's do that job. Like, what job can Eternals do which no one else is doing, which is different in other ways? And in terms of like what attracts me to that, it's always the I'm going to put a little hat over here for a second and think on the personal level is always something I haven't done before. Like, I've done a lot of work for hire, but like something I've not done before, and something I haven't done before is take a book, reinvent it from the ground up. Give it, take this classic, renovate it, and then let it go. And also, this, you know, and then it ties into like a movie as well. That's also interesting. The idea of this is a big, clean, standalone book to try to explain to everyone why you should be into this. And that's something I said. I've done even like Darth Vader is it was the sister book to a bigger book. So I've done a lot of being supporting actor, but I've done very few bits where I've got to completely and utterly renovate something. So that's appealing. And especially with Eternals, Eternals is something which it has so much good stuff in it, but it's never been as big as other books. And trying to work out why it hasn't, and trying to do small, respectful tweaks that kind of drill into why anyone cares about this is 100% like it. So that was the kind of thing. So I've done this. I don't know. It's not the full Hickman, is that way? But,
great term, the great new comic book
honestly, term. Like, me and Jonathan. I mean, Jonathan's a guy who came in at the same time as me, so I quite often think about my work being in conversation with his. And of course, I feel that way about like me and Fraction are similar, and Kelly Sue, and actually Rick as well to some degree. And so Eternals is, for me, it feels like the first post House of X, Powers of X book. You know,
yeah,
and that.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's definitely more because it's not going to spin out to a million other books. But the idea of, okay, we're going to give you by page 4, and the spread on page 4 and 5, we realise, this is a significant amount of thought has gone into this book. Like you said earlier about my mythologies tend to sprawl out. It's like, it's all going to be there on that page. You'll realise, oh my God, Kieron's D&D campaign has come to kill me.
I just want to say I'm very excited to read that. Just talking with you has made me even more excited, which I didn't know I could do. But I wanted to bring it back to Once and Future for a moment and just say that, like, it has been such an honor and so much fun to read and to see you having so much fun with it. But as like the fan a little bit, what for you was the most fun part of working on this book? Like seeing some of the designs, just with the things came together. What for you was like your favorite part of it so far?
It's the jamming of it. It's like it's almost the opposite of something like Die or even Eternals. Is in that that's all about the graphs and the elegance and the this is like the jamming in terms of like, okay, I've got an action sequence. I've got 12 pages for this action sequence, which is a long. I'm going to give Dan enough space to tear it apart. Let's do a full-on action. Okay, and putting problems to the cat. Okay, we're going to have Beowulf on top of this car. I don't know how they're going to get Beowulf off that car. It's like I've left spaces to play, and the same way, like, and it's response to Dan. I see the art, and it's very comics with capital L comics rather than literature. Like I'm always writing with a literary mindset, but like the fact that I am creating spaces where that we can all have fun in this kind of like if I see something Dan or Tamara has done, I'll respond to it. And just so much of my favourite stuff is just because they are such delightful characters. I mean, so like, when I thought, okay, maybe I'll write my Gran, or like someone inspired by my Gran. And I had that line in issue 1 is, you used to hunt vampires. Yeah, what happened? I ran out of vampires. I wrote down that literally, like that was the first thing I wrote for the character, and I saw it in bigger circle around it in terms of that's the character. And like, Bridget is such a strong voice. You can get to. Like you just put her in a situation, she'll say something, and that's the kind of that's what you. I mean, all my favorite characters to write are people who have things to say. Like Bridget, how to phrase? The stuff I agree with Bridget on, and the stuff I disagree on, and that's the fun of it. Like the stuff I would never say because she goes too far, and there's also like the stuff I would never say because she's wrong, and the stuff I would always want to say, but I can never be that cool. That's like, on the writing side. That is the But also the other side, the fact that it's a bit freer, is I can write the character responses really honestly. And this is always a delight when you just look at the situation and realise, they would do that. And then you write the scene. And since you've kept it a bit looser, you can write it. Like there's a scene in I've just handed in issue 15. You know the characters and the bit where you go, oh right, of course they would do that. And you've got to work out how to stop it. Or like the interaction. And the fact that it feels slightly the delightful of improvisation out of control. I've said earlier the game of it. As in, it's a game for me as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to hear you talk about all this because it feels like, and you mentioned this as well a little bit, but there's definitely a connection between all these things. It's you reevaluating mythology, whether it's reevaluating UK mythology or over in Turtles. I imagine at least a part of it is reevaluating the mythology of the Marvel Universe because they've been alive the entire time. What is it about that that's appealing to you?
I mean, like, I'm pretty obsessed with death. Like, it's one of these things like, it's like change is very important to me. And like, that was actually thematically, that was the thing I immediately got with the Eternals. Eternals does not mean living forever. Eternal means unchanging.
Yeah.
And there's something like, as somebody who leans existentialist by philosophy, like the concept of like being capable of change petrifies me. Imagine, like, are we all now what we're going to be forever? As in other words, is there no redemption? Is there no possibility? So is the world just doomed? Because if it's impossible if change is genuinely impossible, as it is for the Eternals. So that was the thing about the Eternals. Or you can really dig into that existentialist horror, the idea of being forced, and at the same time they're absolutely hero figures, but at the same time they are completely. Actually, not true. Not all of them are hero figures, as you will very rapidly see.
Yeah.
But that's real. Like, it's funny because writing about people only live for 2 years allows you to approach the same sort of themes you do approach when writing about people who live forever. They're in some ways just talking about the same thing, because if you use a fantasy device to heighten a situation, you bring increased focus and clarity to the actual what you're talking about. The question for both those things is, what is the point of life anyway? Like, why are we here? What do we do? And that's and who are we? And all those things are really exciting, especially when we float back to stories, and stories are. And one of the big points of Wickdiv is be really careful about what stories you choose to believe about yourself, especially if they're stories you want to believe, because they're the ones you are easy. They're the stuff you fall for, you know. And all the way, and that. I mean, there's a lot about Wickdiv about being a critical reader of the world, and just be aware of your prejudices. Be careful, because belief is a bit like I mean, this, of course, is taken even further into What's the Future. There's a line Bridget, I think, drops in issue 14 or so, and it's very much like stories like maggots crawling for your brain, and then she goes way further into that. So all that stuff ties together for me. So I'm not sure if I answered the question, but I might have tried to answer every question in the world ever simultaneously.
You're answering all questions at once. I have one more about, you mentioned Eternals. You feel like you're renovating that. So what are if there was a house, what are the bones of the Eternals that you're like, oh, these are the necessary parts, and now I get to change everything else?
Right. Some of it is just reframing it. And I think there's a couple of things I don't want to talk about yet, just because, like,
sure.
Yeah.
We'll get to them. Like, there's so much stuff. Like, if I talk about it's one of these bits where if I talk about any bit of it, I could just, the fractalness there, because I'm deliberately making it bigger than the page. As in making it's actually a very Grant Morrison move. But the world is bigger than the frame. As in, like, there's lots of cool stuff here that we could, if we carry on this book, we can eventually get to this stuff maybe. But it's nice that it's there. But at the same time, the core of what I think is interesting, like the way Kirby created it was very much riffing on Chariot of the Gods 1970s stuff. The idea that the gods on Earth are actually aliens who we've mistaken. And the slight tension with Eternals always has been, it wasn't originally in the Marvel Universe. And the problem being that job of gods on Earth is taken by the gods. And it's quite hard to take them this seriously, or it's make them as important as okay, someone who was mistaken for Thor, or actual Thor, and there's very really good writers have done like really interesting ways to sort of square that circle in terms of like how gods and god imposters exist at the same time, but it doesn't quite. That's the bit that has trouble gelling in the Marvel universe, and also means that the Eternals kind of take the job of the gods, and they just can't take that job because Thor's got that job. So it's like, but if you actually look at the Eternals myth is the Celestials arrived on Earth, created 100 deviants, who are basically devils, is the better way of putting it. And then he created like 100 Eternals, and then he left, and then the gods left.
Yeah.
And of course the weird thing about that idea is that doesn't make the Eternals gods. Like we've already got the gods because the Celestials are the gods. What the Eternals are angels.
Right.
Like if you think about like in terms of the role they are the guardian angel, they are basically the guardian protectors of Earth, eternally facing off against these deviants. Like, they're angels, and that's the kind of like that's the emotional place they hang in the world. And there's a line I use in the thing. Imagine a species of eternal Buffy the Vampire Slayers. Like imagine Buffy the Vampire Slayer meets RoboCop. It's one of these things where
now you're talking.
They are like they've got programming, so they have to follow certain rules, or Asimovian rules, and their rules play out in lots of different ways. And of course, how the rules are interpreted is why you get different Eternals. It's that kind of like, I'm really going in too deep now. But the character equivalent to their Satan is the best way of putting it. Like one of the Eternals, who the mission is to protect the Earth. The best way to protect the Earth is to kill everything else, everyone on it, and then just the Eternals will be fine. Like we don't need these pesky. As in, genuinely, genocide is the way forward for the Eternals. And everyone else went, not actually. To be honest, not everyone else. Everyone went, no, let's not do that. And now he's in prison forever in hell. And then various other people have different approaches throughout the centuries. So, but the basic concept is these are unchanging, eternally living beings who protect Earth, whatever that means. And anybody who's read the Bible knows angels can really do some messed up stuff if they feel the need to. And that's the niche, I think. Well, that's the cool thing. That's in the idea. And of course, the deviants aren't all bad guys either. That's the other thing. Like most of the deviants, more like I describe like deviant city of Lemuria, like Fraggle Rock meets hell. Like most kids are pretty cool people. Just occasionally one of them goes off the deep end, and that's where the problem hits.
Yeah, I'm excited for the deviants to eat a lot of radishes. Delicious. I think I know the answer to this one, but I only ask because I'm sure it's going to be top of mind for a lot of people. What, if any, is the coordination between the Eternals and the movie? Like, should people go in expecting to read Angelina Jolie and Kumail Nanjiani, or is it very much its own two trains running?
It's always like the comics always their own thing. Like we definitely make it easier. We want people to cross over. That'd be rude. Imagine how rude it would be to say no. But like, it's always got to be. It's like it's not something I really talk about much. But like, whilst of course there is synergy between the two, the line we always get told when we're writing is, you're not writing the present movie. You're writing the movie four movies down the road. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like that's kind of the point of the book set, and this has got to be new and exciting. Whilst accessibility is great, you're not a supplementary piece. You're a piece of the future, I guess.
Right.
Interesting. Before we start to wrap up here, you've already given us plenty of teases, but what is coming up in Once and Future that folks can look forward to, particularly as we start to potentially wrap up this Grendel and Beowulf storyline?
Well, it's like, there's the climax of this. The thing about like the second arc, Old English, it's really got that kind of half and half structure. Like, the first half is about Beowulf, and it's the big adventure of London exploration. And the second half, I've got the idea of just doing the slasher movie around the house, except the house is an old people's home, and the woman is the grandma. And I was just like, let's just really do it straight, do it creepily around the house. We build to the climax, and then this is my classic, but like. Whenever I'm doing an ongoing, it's the end of the arc. The end of the arc is we resolve the story and then everything changes. Like we have a significant status quo change. Like the end of last arc was like Merlin's arrival, and that just came out of nowhere. It was got foreshadowed. Well, this is very much like the remaining pieces are thrown up in the air, and there's one big final beat, and you're like, oh right, that also changes everything. Which leads, annoyingly, I don't even want to say the name of the third arc yet, and I've got it. I'm quite happy with it. But that is mainly back to Arthurian stuff. It is Rose is increasingly important in it. It's kind of like this is where like Rose has been like an important like secondary player, but I wanted to bring her on stage more, do more about her.
Yeah.
She's like I like her a lot, but like there just hasn't been enough for her yet. So she's really central. It all happens in a couple of days before New Year's. Like, so in other words, it's quite it's end of the year, so we get the kind of the holly and the ivy vibe going on. And we get a little bit more about Mary / Nimue / Elaine. So we get a bit more about her background as well. So yeah, basically there's a lot of those sort of mysteries come back, and there's also the entry into their world of the big problem from the end of the arc. You know what I mean? And it's fun. And it's like, and the end of that arc is the biggest change in the entire run so far. That's the kind of issue 18 into issue 19 would be this apocalyptic change of status quo. Is that there was actually a world where I was just going to end at issue 18, but now I'm not. I'm carrying on. But there was a kind of like, oh yeah, that's an interesting place to end the book.
Ooh, that's a very good tease. Kieron, thank you so much for being here. Loving Once and Future. Very excited to read the rest of it. Thanks so much for spending so much time.
Thank you. It's been amazing to be here.
Great to talk to you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And all of you listening out there, a couple of things to plug. You can support this podcast and other podcasts we do at patreon.com/comicbookclub. Also do a live show every Tuesday at 7 p.m. to Crowdcast and YouTube. Come hang out. We'll almost definitely be chatting about Once and Future pretty much every time it comes out. iTunes, Android, Spotify, Stitcher, and the app of your choice to subscribe and listen to the show. comicbookclublive.com for this podcast and many more. Until next time, Comic Book Club out. Whoosh.